Hello and welcome back to the ECODISTURB podcast. So ECODISTURB is an interdisciplinary research group funded by the University of Oslo, and between 2021 and 2024 we'll be working to map and to challenge Nordic responses to climate change. And at the moment we're running an interdisciplinary Anthropocene course, and these podcasts are devoted to discussing issues that have arisen during these lectures. And one of our starting points is that climate crisis and loss of nature are among the greatest challenges of our times. Nordic reactions in particular are deeply ambivalent. We have destruction and recreation, gift, guilt, and grace. So recognizing that one of the shortcomings of environmentalism has been its tendency to favour unifying perspectives, especially in the Nordic region, the approach of ECODISTURB assumes tension, contradiction, and conflict to be the norm rather than the exception. Okay, so with me here today, we have our team of seminar leaders.
I'm Christina Nadeau. I'm a PhD student at the biology department here at the University of Oslo, studying tipping points in nature, climate and society.
And I'm Christian Haugestad, a PhD candidate at the Department of Psychology, studying climate distress in youth at the moment. Glad to be here.
And I'm Simone Kotva, Research Fellow in the Faculty of Theology, working on religion and ecology. Okay, so we decided we're just going to dive right in, and we're going to be reflecting on the recent lecture by Sissel Furuseth, who is Professor of Nordic Literature, and she's been talking about the portrayal of oil in Norwegian culture, particularly literature, but also film more broadly. And one of the things that she draws out, it speaks very much to the tenor of our project, which is the ambivalent reaction. Like, on the one hand, this is heightened in Norway because of oil. On the one hand, there is this keen sense for like nature, back to nature movements are very big, and there is a lot of like outdoor activities being emphasized and seen as like leading to the good life. On the other hand, we have this entire lifestyle maintained and subsidized largely by an environmentally destructive economy, oil. So Petro aesthetics becomes this, and Petro in general becomes this point of real kind of contradiction and like clashing perspectives, which is heightened in Norway. But you could also extrapolate from that. I would like to, because I'm Swedish, but I see like a lot of similarities. Even though Sweden doesn't have oil, it has this like high welfare standard subsidized by extractive economies, right? So I think some of those contradictions is where we're going to like take off, and then maybe also discuss the response by Aslak Sira Myhre and how we thought that like interacted with Sissel's lecture.
I can dive in with my first initial feelings on the lecture, as I found it quite refreshing. I've had a lot of conversations with various people about the situation in the petroleum industry in Norway. It's the reason I'm personally in Norway. My family moved here because of the jobs in Stavanger.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
In the 90s, yeah. So Sissel actually referred to the oil children, and I am very much one of them, and grew up around people who mainly worked in the oil industry. And so in recent years, I've had a lot of very difficult conversations with many people, because I think this very much summarizes this lecture in particular, which was, it was very driven by emotions. That's what I felt anyway. And that's why I thought it was really refreshing, Sissel's take on the petroleum discourse in Norway, because it's usually very hard fact driven, and it's usually an argument, but she very much focused on the cultural aspect of how the oil industry is portrayed in Norway and what this has meant for the Norwegian people. But also she said something really interesting, which was that the reason why she focuses on the literature about oil and gas is because a future without oil and gas is fiction, or is partially still fiction, because we know that it will have to come to fruition at some point, but it is still very much like unimaginable to us. So to explore this idea of a world, or even Norway without oil, is still very much fiction. So that's how she justified why this is so interesting, to delve into the literature and see how this is evolved just since the 60s in Norway, and how this has shaped people's experiences in very much near in the future and in a very close generational sense. It's changed people's lives a lot in this country. So
and many of them for the better. I think
Yeah.
I can speak for most of Norwegian society regarding the economic development the oil and the industry have brought to us, and I think it's a very important part of the Norwegian society and the culture. But what I found striking about the lecture was this focus and emphasis about how some of these contradictions and ambivalence come to very close to the senses in a way that through the literature and through the portrayals close to the oil industry we can kind of see and reimagine in this dystopian or utopian portrayals of life after oil, that it still makes us feel, it engages us in a very much closer manner to the petroleum industry and what it has had of meaning to people's lives. So I think one of the arguments made during the lecture and the responses afterwards was this importance of understanding this perspective, both from the petroleum workers and the people connected to the industry, and seeing their emotional engagement in it, but also in the sort of discussion around it and environmental policy, for example, that it has in many ways been demonized and been discussed as this big evil industry, and how that might not be such a productive way of portraying it. And through the literature we can see that it makes it kind of easier to delve into these ambivalences.
Yes, because demonizing it, I also really like that. I mean, demonizing anything is bad news, right? It's not going to lead to a solution, I guess, although solutions is perhaps not the best way to think about the situation. But the way in which literature, I mean, that's what I was taking away from it a lot, like the role of the imagination and these narratives as like not just fanciful ways of escaping the reality we're in, but actually doing something quite scientific. It's almost like technical in the precision, as you say, like of the imagining the senses and imagining emotional reactions to these situations in ways that you don't get when it's just number crunching, right? And that's something that we talk about a lot, the role of these non-scientific narratives in actually helping science to work out like pathways.
Exactly. Our imagination is often the most powerful tool we can have to tackle these big questions, these big problems when it comes to climate change, because we are all just individuals in this big problem, this big global issue. And in order to empathize and create some sort of cohesive movement, we need to be able to understand each other and move, and therefore come together and move forward together at the same time. And the only way to be able to accurately try and create a future and think about how it can be made is through our imagination. And this can be done in many ways. It can be either quite scary or it can be quite hopeful. And we've spoken a little bit in the past about how hope can be either a tool, like a positive tool, or perhaps even a negative tool. It creates perhaps a bit of dissonance.
The illusion of one solution.
Yes, definitely.
And I find the Cecil's lecture and discussion about this really illuminating in a way, because coming from psychology and more towards the hard sciences, I think really studying and delving into these literary perspectives on this issue also has in many ways a way of enabling us to understand each other even better, and kind of allowing us for this perspective taking in understanding the meaning, both the industry but also the destruction of nature, the meaning it has on people's lives. So I found it really valuable what she said in the discussions of this ambivalence specifically.
Yeah. It's like, it reminds me of Perspectivism, talking about like having, not that everything's relative, right? Because you could, like, the discussion we're just having could sound a bit like we're trying to dodge the bullet here of like oil needs to be dealt with, right? By saying that all these literary perspectives humanizes the oil industry somehow, in part, and that's not what we're saying at all. Actually, I mean that's to reduce it, but at the same, what I think Cecil is interested in, at least this is how I hear it, is that when we can entertain or kind of appreciate multiple perspectives at once, we have a better chance of not simply imposing a solution on someone or groups of people for whom that will be violent, but to work together and negotiate and listen. And so literature can do that. But it can also be quite violent and imposing, right? So it's not like literature is some kind of safe place, or like a neutral zone for narratives.
But it is a place that is neutral in a way that depending on what discipline or what expertise you have, it is a bit of a neutral playing field. We can all, and that's the role of media and literature, is so that usually most people can engage with it in some way. So it opens up the dialogue to people who have different experiences and perhaps different opinions. So I thought it was a very good way to approach the petroleum industry conversation here in Norway, without throwing a bunch of graphs on the screen and saying, you know, oh, this is because of this industry, and so it was. I think it was a very good way, perhaps a soft way, to open up the conversation. And it was very beneficial, I think. She opened up with saying that Norway does have a responsibility, because despite being a very small country, it has contributed a lot to overall historic greenhouse gas emissions. But even she opened up with this idea of responsibility, but also incorporating why this is so hard for Norway to let go of necessarily, and perhaps why it's hard for us all to let go of. We're focusing on the oil industry, but we are all consumers in this world that is inherently unsustainable. So it's a way to have a conversation about ourselves, but talking about an industry that is central to the conversation. I think it can go a bit deeper than just the petroleum industry, and perhaps it kind of highlights perhaps the problems of why we refuse, or not refuse, but why we find difficulty in moving into this imaginary future without oil and gas and fossil fuels. So
because they represent something else. I mean, they're symbolic here, right? Yeah. It's not so much necessarily the oil and gas itself, but the lifestyle that an extractive economy enables. So that we know that if we were to switch over completely to renewable, we would have to change our habits of consumption, right?
Yes.
Without doing significant damage to the landscape in ways that are now becoming increasingly difficult, and for good reason. So we can't just like replace. And so there is this kind of symbol also of the lifestyle that an extractive economy makes possible.
And I find it really productive in the discussion regarding the concept of the Anthropocene and whether it can be a useful term for further analysis. Or I think Cecil makes this point that it's not necessarily the Anthropocene as a concept that is useful for understanding the petroaesthetic literature, but rather the other way around, that looking at literature about the petroleum can help us understand the Anthropocene concept as an acknowledgement of the human influence on the physical Earth systems, and looking at it through the felt experiences, the lived lives connected to the oil industry.
And then it becomes a kind of model for how to engage in other fields as well, right, with the Anthropocene.
Of a kind of localized lived experience with the interconnection between people and the Earth systems, plants, animals, and minerals.
Mm-hmm. And that's the goal of these lectures. Ultimately, is to present different disciplines and the information from these different disciplines, and in order to help people with conversations in the real world. And those conversations aren't always systematic and calm conversations. They're usually fueled with everyone's experience, and that's something that I picked up on in the response, where I believe he wasn't so keen on the term Anthropocene, and a few of the reasons that he gave are things that we've actually addressed in previous lectures. So I hope that people took that on board, because I think one of his arguments was there just hasn't been enough time for there to be a new geological epoch. So he very much focused on that aspect rather than focusing on the other aspects of massive change that we've experienced in the Anthropocene. And we've spoken about time in a previous lecture, and I hope that through that knowledge, people are able to utilize that and come to the table and say, okay, well, maybe I agree with you, in the sense that there hasn't, on a geological timescale, it hasn't been enough time for this to really make a dent in the geological sense of things. But if you look at other disciplines, then this has had a big impact.
It's a sort of the narratives, right? The stories
Yes.
that we tell of the Anthropocene. We talked. It was so lovely that our first conversation last week about this. The kind of the way in which perhaps the Anthropocene is most useful in the soft sciences, although that term isn't very nice. But yeah, and I love that kind of the openness about what the concept is good for and what it's not so good for. So as a theologian, petroaesthetics interests me hugely, also for these like religious dimensions of the term and the kind of the activity of extractive economies that are built into it. And I know that's something that Sissif thinks with a bit as well. And the way in which like the activity of extracting oil and then just polluting the planet kind of incurs a debt of guilt, and the idea of kind of petro guilt, and it's really loaded basically, because that's sort of what's at issue. And also one of the points of our project is to, from a psychological point of view, also kind of lay bare some of the pitfalls of that kind of thinking. So that, I mean, there is a responsibility here and there's a culpability, but at the same time, it's very much like this question of like, who caused the Anthropocene? Does an individual Norwegian actually contribute? Like, how does the oil industry relate to this kind of Norwegian culture, which is so infatuated with the idea of belonging in place?
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because I find it quite hard, and I think that's a sense that we were feeling while we're talking here, that it's kind of difficult to address some of these issues as a part of our culture or place identity, and all the benefits the oil and economic development has brought to our lives, and feeling this sense of guilt and addressing it in a way in public conversations about the role Norway has to play internationally, for example, historical responsibility and all that kind of discussions. And some have pointed out this as a Norwegian paradox, right? Internationally, Norway feels like a green leader in many ways, while at the same time polluting, and living in this double position, in a sense, makes or lays the ground for quite ambivalent positions about this, and definitely pointing out this as a guilt narrative as well might not be the way of engaging more within populations closely knit with the industry, and also kind of acknowledging this pride and all the development this has brought with, I think is a part of the conversation, acknowledging and also being thankful for that in a way that doesn't eschew the guilt and responsibility imbued in it. But psychologically, this is quite difficult to hold both thoughts in mind at the same time.
Yeah, it's so difficult, and it's so much more difficult when the person in front of you has, is a real person and has a face. I think it's so easy to talk about the oil industry when they're, big oil, and they're like, it's some person in a big office somewhere, and you never have to talk to them in person. But when they have, when they have a face and they tell you about their story and how this has changed their life, and you're telling them that the industry that essentially gave them so much in their life is the reason for this global destruction, it's so much harder to have that kind of holier than thou conversation of I'm right and you're not, your experience isn't valid, because it is valid. And yeah, I definitely feel even just having a conversation now, it's not an easy thing to unpack, for sure. And I tend to have interesting thought. I always think I have good arguments against or prepared for people who are more invested in the petroleum industry until I get face to face with them, and then I don't know what to say, because it's how can my information be more valid than theirs? And it is quite a difficult thing to unpack. And like you say, it is this paradox that exists in Norway.
And it's heightened by tension and antagonism, as you say, like sure. When the aim is, the way you describe it, I think is so true to the situations where we feel that we have to convince the other, or sort of somehow confront the oil industry and show that it's wrong. And a combative attitude like that is never going to really lead to long-term collaboration and cooperation, which is what we want. So the challenge, and we've talked about this in our discussions, is not to kind of crush capitalism and the petroleum industry, but to change it from within, and hopefully through conversations with petroleum industry. Now that sounds possibly a bit naive and hopeful, but I think realistically that's the only future we have. We're not going to have a future that's entirely post-oil in the near future, but we may have a future where oil is changing, like the oil industry changes itself, and that it will be forced to do so, because it's a finite resource, so we are running out of oil. But I think those how to affect those changes, which is something that I'm really interested in, we'll be talking about in my lecture, how do you change a kind of mindset about oil? And I'm super interested when I read Petro aesthetics written from the position of indigeneity, where oil is a person, and it's not something you just take, but you kind of interact and you give to it and you sort of listen for it. And I don't know, I think that oil is not necessarily going to become an animistic industry, but it will have to change, and those changes will be key to keep an eye on, and also where the influence will make the most difference in those changes.
Yes, I'm a bit more skeptical to the change from within narrative. But that's just because I know that I think I'm just going to quickly address something in the lecture again, which is that I very much appreciated the conversation that was happening, but I felt as though lots of the narratives that were brought up were not new to me, but that's maybe because I engage in these conversations quite often. But essentially what I think is that there's just there's a lot of resistance. For me, this is very much about this lecture was why we are still stuck in this system where we are, and the resistance that we see in the big industries to change from within are also reflected in our own resistance to change. I mean, we're all being told that some sort of radical change has to come soon, but taking that action is difficult for everyone. It's difficult for the industries, and it's difficult for the individual people. So yes, I think the whole, if I'm going to be skeptical about the change from within narrative, I also have to address my own skepticism of change from within for myself.
Yeah, that's a really good parallel.
Yeah,
it's a really good parallel, because as you say, like, it's an organic, like the oil industry is basically like a person, and it has the same difficulties changing itself as a person will have. And working out how people change their habits of consumption, habits in general, will be key to kind of how the oil industry changes. And I mean, it will have to change because finite resource, right? But it's the question of like how that's going to happen. Did you have a...
No, I was thinking, yes, there can be a parallel of comparing the oil industry with a person and acknowledging our own stance in this, and our own difficulties with changing our habits. But I'm also worried as to how that may, in a sense, fail to acknowledge the power position these institutions are in, and whether if we essentialize them in a way so that okay, we acknowledge the difficulties, but then again, looking at for example arguments about say population growth, and that's one of the main issues with climate change, is definitely a valid point, but then again that's something probably way on the side of individual agency, or whether organizations or states have this, and the power structures that enable them to change. I think those have to be addressed in a sense. Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm making clear my argument here, but
no, I'm so glad you brought it up, because that reminded me of my biggest issue with this, of the rebuttal in the lecture, which was the fact that those power structures weren't actually addressed. It was very much kept at the individual, like, worker level in the oil industry. It didn't really address the industry as this big, this like, I mean, I know I spoke about it, and this is why it's hard to have a conversation about it, because, you know, it's not just a like big oil, but he didn't bring up the fact that there's this big economical power indifference when it comes to the oil industry and the people who are trying to perhaps change it. And also, when he brought up the population problem, the fact that individuals are not equal in their consumption, so that is a really, it's kind of not. It's not invalid to bring up, but it's also not productive to bring up as an argument for why the oil industry should continue the way that it is now, because it's very much ignoring those imbalances in people, you know, globally, if that makes sense. I don't know if I'm making much sense right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's ways of dodging the... Again, like dodging the bullet that we have to change, and that we will have to change, and we're probably just going to be forced into shifting habits of consumption through exterior pressures, right? Eventually, and what environmental discourse tries to do is like preempt that by changing us before we're forced to change.
Yes, and we need to.
Yeah.
Well, we've just had. This is kind of a good segue into the fact that this lecture came before the next one, which is going to discuss the IPCC reports.
Yeah.
So, it's we've spoken. We've had a lecture about the oil industry we're following this by talking about the IPCC report and why this agency is needed and why we cannot wait for these external factors to influence the industries. We can't wait for oil to deplete and that be the reason that we move forward with the renewable energy transition. It has to be now because we're working against a deadline, a planetary deadline.
And that, I mean, I guess that finally, something that I find really worrying about the Scandinavian situation in particular, because what we've said now, I mean, this is applicable to kind of oil worldwide, but in Scandinavia we face this Givon's paradox, which is that we have good economies, right? So that we would be able to, if we divested in oil and extractive fossil fuel economies, we'd be able to buy that from other places where it's not yet been divested from. So, which is a particular kind of dilemma that appears in Scandinavia, where habits of consumption stay and indeed kind of go up even during times of divesting, which is something that the oil industry in other parts of the world don't necessarily face in the same way. Because so it's like there's that comes back to this narrative of like guilt and culpability and so on, right? That unless there is this change in habits of consumption, especially in Scandinavia, we can continue to actually support the extraction of fossil fuels because we have the economic means to do so. I mean, this has proved to be true in the case of Sweden, for instance, and the way people choose to spend the money that they save on like more environmentally sustainable forms of electricity and fuel and things. So it just introduces like another layer and an interesting one in terms of contradiction and like the psychology of it, sort of the virtue signaling that Norway might produce for its population if it manages to divest from oil, but if rates of consumption don't actually change, then we're still going to be buying goods produced using fossil fuels in other places, so it's still like contributing.
That's true. And when we look at the global footprint calculator, Norway is quite up there in if everyone on Earth lived the way that people in Norway live, then like Earth Overshoot Day would be far earlier than the average. I think it was in July last year, on average. But if they only used the measurements from Norway or the data from Norway, it would have been in April. Yeah. I mean, that's a significant difference. So, yeah, you're right about this virtue signaling, but the consumption problem is still there. So, yes, I don't really know how to.
Well, I hope we don't come up with solutions because
we're not here for solutions, are we? Well, we are. We're here for constructive conversations.
I hope so.
Yes. This is a particularly hard one, and I think we saw that in the lecture, that it is very difficult to talk about, and it brings up a lot of emotions, and it's hard to speak about something fictional. Perhaps that's maybe what it comes down to. We're all speaking about this fictional future, and that's different for everyone.
But that's probably a way to bring it back to the lecture and the analysis of literature, in the sense that its interaction with scientific literature opens up this conversation about what kind of futures we can imagine, and how will they look like, what would they feel like, how would our lives be if this and that happens, how will it be in 400 years, for example. It has this really interesting interaction between the things that we take as hard science and the ways we imagine them in the literature, that opens the door for really imagining. And I think the interaction between the literature and sci-fi and cli-fi, as some people call it, the science fiction within the climate, that it has some effects socially, that enables a wider conversation about the futures we can expect or want to avoid.
Yes.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, dystopia. Yeah.
Yes, I think that was brought up in the lecture actually. This whole apocalyptic kind of view of climate change and how that's I can't remember. I don't want to put words into anyone's mouth. I don't think it. I think perhaps it was kind of said it was a bit. It was like not dramatic, but I think it wasn't far from that, and how that shouldn't, we shouldn't be using fear to drive this narrative. So, yes.
Yeah, it's the old kind of monastic morals, like how do you encourage better behaviour? Do you whip people into shape, or do you tempt them by fear, or do you sort of do the slower, more gentle method? But that takes more time, and we're always up against this like deadline thinking, and I think that actually screws up a lot of the reasoning, because these things take time. Like they will take time. Unless there is, I mean, we haven't talked about that film, but unless there's an actual kind of event that's going to happen in like a week's time. But the reality is probably going to be slower and more drawn out, and then our sense of time shifts, don't they?
Especially when the consequences remain, as Sissel was kind of speaking about, fiction. So it's hard to push. It's hard to push for agency when, at least in Norway for now, the reality of climate change is still fiction, as well as the future without oil is still fiction. So it's hard. It's hard to bring that into the present without our imagination and without looking into literature and film. It's a very good tool to be able to play out different scenarios and have emotional connections with them without having to actually live them ourselves, and perhaps impact our daily lives now.
Yeah, that's probably quite a good place to wrap up with those fiction impacting our lives and the importance of imagining. Yeah. So thank you so much. This is really fun, and we're going to be talking about the next lecture quite soon. Yeah. So tell us what you think about these conversations. If they're helpful, we'd love to hear from you about them.